Literature.
Literature, in its broadest sense, is any written work. Etymologically, the term derives from Latin literatura, literatura, writing formed with letters, although some definitions include spoken or sung texts. More restrictively, it is writing that possesses literary merit, and language that foregrounds literariness, as opposed to ordinary language. Literature can be classified according to whether it is fiction or non-fiction, and whether it is poetry or prose. It can be further distinguished according to major forms such as the novel, short story or drama. And works are often categorized according to historical periods, or according to their adherence to certain aesthetic features or expectations. Taken to mean only written works, literature was first produced by some of the world's earliest civilizations, those of ancient Egypt and Sumeria, as early as the 4th millennium BC. Taken to include spoken or sung texts, it originated even earlier, and some of the first written works may have been based on an already existing oral tradition. As urban cultures and societies developed, there was a proliferation in the forms of literature. Developments in print technology allowed for literature to be distributed and experienced on an unprecedented scale, which has culminated in the 21st century in electronic literature.
Definition.
There have been various attempts to define literature. Simon and Delise Ryan begin their attempt to answer the question, what is literature? With the observation. Definitions of literature have varied over time. It is a culturally relative definition. In Western Europe prior to the 18th century, literature as a term indicated all books and writing. A more restricted sense of the term emerged during the Romantic period, in which it began to demarcate imaginative literature. Contemporary debates over what constitutes literature can be seen as returning to the older, more inclusive notion of what constitutes literature. Cultural studies, for instance, takes as its subject of analysis both popular and minority genres, in addition to canonical works. The value judgment definition of literature considers it to exclusively include writing that possesses a literary quality or distinction, forming part of the so-called belles lettres, fine writing tradition. This is the definition used in the Encyclopaedia Britannica 11th edition, 1910-11, when it classifies literature as the best expression of the best thought reduced to writing. However, this is the result that there is no objective definition of what constitutes literature. Anything can be literature, and anything which is universally regarded as literature has the potential to be excluded, since value judgments can change over time. The formalist definition is that the language of literature foregrounds poetic effects. It is the literariness, or poeticity of literature that distinguishes it from ordinary speech or other kinds of writing, for example journalism. Jim Mayer considers this a useful characteristic in explaining the use of the term to mean published material in a particular field, for example. Scientific literature, as such writing must use language according to particular standards. The problem with the formalist definition is that in order to say that literature deviates from ordinary uses of language, those uses must first be identified. This is difficult because ordinary language is an unstable category, differing according to social categories and across history. Etymologically, the term derives from Latin literatura, literatura learning, a writing, grammar, originally writing formed with letters, from litera letter. In spite of this, the term has also been applied to spoken or sung texts.
Major forms. Poetry.
Poetry is a form of literary art which uses aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of language to evoke meanings in addition to, or in place of, prosaic ostensible meaning. Poetry has traditionally been distinguished from prose by its being set in verse. Prose is cast in sentences, poetry in lines. The syntax of prose is dictated by meaning, whereas that of poetry is held across meter or the visual aspects of the poem. Prior to the 19th century, poetry was commonly understood to be something set in metrical lines. Accordingly, in 1658 a definition of poetry is any kind of subject consisting of rhythm or verses. Possibly as a result of Aristotle's influence, his Poetics, Poetry before the 19th century was usually less a technical designation for verse than a normative category of fictive or rhetorical art. As a form it may predate literacy, with the earliest works being composed within and sustained by an oral tradition. Hence it constitutes the earliest example of literature.
Prose.
Prose is a form of language that possesses ordinary syntax and natural speech rather than rhythmic structure. In which regard, along with its measurement in sentences rather than lines, it differs from poetry. On the historical development of prose, Richard Graff notes that recent scholarship has emphasized the fact that formal prose was a comparatively late development, an invention properly associated with the classical period. Novel, a long fictional prose narrative. It was the form's close relation to real life that differentiated it from the chivalric romance. In most European languages the equivalent term is Roman, indicating the proximity of the forms. In English, the term emerged from the Romance languages in the late 15th century, with the meaning of news. It came to indicate something new, without a distinction between fact or fiction. Although there are many historical prototypes, so-called novels before the novel, the modern novel form emerges late in cultural history, roughly during the 18th century. Initially subject to much criticism, the novel has acquired a dominant position amongst literary forms, both popularly and critically. Novella, in purely quantitative terms, the novella exists between the novel and short story. The publisher Melville House classifies it as too short to be a novel, too long to be a short story. There is no precise definition in terms of word or page count. Literary prizes and publishing houses often have their own arbitrary limits, which vary according to their particular intentions. Summarizing the variable definitions of the novella, William Giraldi concludes, whose identity seems destined to be disputed into perpetuity. It has been suggested that the size restriction of the form produces various stylistic results, both some that are shared with a novel or short story, and others unique to the form. Short story, a dilemma in defining the short story as a literary form is how to, or whether one should, distinguish it from any short narrative. Hence it also has a contested origin, variably suggested as the earliest short narratives, for example the Bible, early short story writers, for example Edgar Allan Poe, or the clearly modern short story writers, for example Anton Chekhov. Apart from its distinct size, various theorists have suggested that the short story has a characteristic subject matter or structure. These discussions often position the form in some relation to the novel.
History.
The history of literature follows closely the development of civilization. When defined exclusively as written work, ancient Egyptian literature, along with Sumerian literature, are considered the world's oldest literatures. The primary genres of the literature of ancient Egypt, didactic texts, hymns and prayers, and tales, were almost entirely written in verse. While use of poetic devices is clearly recognizable, the prosody of the verse is unknown. Different historical periods are reflected in literature. National and tribal sagas, accounts of the origin of the world and of customs, and myths which sometimes carry moral or spiritual messages predominate in the pre-urban eras. The epics of Homer, dating from the early to Middle Iron Age, and the great Indian epics of a slightly later period, have more evidence of deliberate literary authorship, surviving like the older myths through oral tradition for long periods before being written down. As a more urban culture developed, academies provided a means of transmission for speculative and philosophical literature in early civilizations, resulting in the prevalence of literature in ancient China, ancient India, Persia and ancient Greece and Rome. Many works of earlier periods, even in narrative form, had a cover moral or didactic purpose, such as the Sanskrit Panchatantra or the Metamorphoses of Ovid. Drama and satire also developed as urban culture provided a larger public audience, and later readership, for literary production. Lyric poetry, as opposed to epic poetry, was often the speciality of courts and aristocratic circles, particularly in East Asia where songs were collected by the Chinese aristocracy as poems, the most notable being the Shi Jing or Book of Songs. Over a long period, the poetry of popular pre-literate balladry and song interpenetrated and eventually influenced poetry in the literary medium. In ancient China, early literature was primarily focused on philosophy, historiography, military science, agriculture, and poetry. China, the origin of modern papermaking and woodblock printing, produced one of the world's first print cultures. Much of Chinese literature originates with the Hundred Schools of Thought period that occurred during the Eastern Zhou dynasty, 769–269 BCE. The most important of these include the classics of Confucianism, of Taoism, of Mahism, of legalism, as well as works of military science, for example Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and Chinese history, for example Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian. Ancient Chinese literature had a heavy emphasis on historiography, with often very detailed court records. An exemplary piece of narrative history of ancient China was the Zuozuan, which was compiled no later than 389 BCE, and attributed to the blind 5th century BCE historian Zhou Quming. In ancient India, literature originated from stories that were originally orally transmitted. Early genres included drama, fables, sutras and epic poetry. Sanskrit literature begins with the Vedas, dating back to 1500–1000 BCE, and continues with the Sanskrit epics of Iron Age India. The Vedas are among the oldest sacred texts. The Samhitas, Vedic collections, date to roughly 1500–1000 BCE, and the Circum-Vedic texts, as well as the redaction of the Samhitas, date to c. 1000–500 BCE, resulting in a Vedic period, spanning the mid-2nd to mid-1st millennium BCE, or the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The period between approximately the 6th to 1st centuries BC saw the composition and redaction of the two most influential Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, with subsequent redaction progressing down to the 4th century AD. In ancient Greece, the epics of Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Hesiod, who wrote Works and Days and Theogony, are some of the earliest, and most influential, of ancient Greek literature. Classical Greek genres included philosophy, poetry, historiography, comedies and dramas. Plato and Aristotle authored philosophical texts that are the foundation of Western philosophy. Sappho and Pindar were influential lyrical poets, and Herodotus and Thucydides were early Greek historians. Although drama was popular in ancient Greece, of the hundreds of tragedies written and performed during the Classical Age, only a limited number of plays by three authors still exist: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The plays of Aristophanes provide the only real examples of a genre of comic drama known as Old Comedy, the earliest form of Greek comedy, and are in fact used to define the genre. Roman histories and biographies anticipated the extensive medieval literature of lives of saints and miraculous chronicles, but the most characteristic form of the Middle Ages was the Romance, an adventurous and sometimes magical narrative with strong popular appeal. Controversial, religious, political and instructional literature proliferated during the Renaissance as a result of the invention of printing, while the medieval romance developed into a more character-based and psychological form of narrative, the novel, of which early and important examples are the Chinese Monkey and the German Faust books. In the Age of Reason, philosophical tracts and speculations on history and human nature integrated literature with social and political developments. The inevitable reaction was the explosion of Romanticism in the later 18th century, which reclaimed the imaginative and fantastical bias of old romances and folk literature and asserted the primacy of individual experience and emotion. But as the 19th century went on, European fiction evolved towards realism and naturalism, the meticulous documentation of real life and social trends. Much of the output of naturalism was implicitly polemical, and influenced social and political change, but 20th century fiction and drama moved back towards the subjective, emphasizing unconscious motivations and social and environmental pressures on the individual. Writers such as Proust, Eliot, Joyce, Kafka and Pirandello exemplify the trend of documenting internal rather than external realities. Genre fiction also showed it could question reality in its 20th century forms. in spite of its fixed formulas, through the inquiries of the skeptical detective and the alternative realities of science fiction. The separation of mainstream and genre forms, including journalism, continued to blur during the period up to our own times. William Burroughs, in his early works, and Hunter S. Thompson expanded documentary reporting into strong subjective statements after the Second World War, and postmodern critics have disparaged the idea of objective realism in general.
Awards.
There are numerous awards recognizing achievement and contribution in literature. Given the diversity of the field, awards are typically limited in scope, usually on form, genre, language, nationality and output, for example for first-time writers or debut novels. The Nobel Prize in Literature was one of the 5 Nobel Prizes established by the will of Alfred Nobel in 1895, and is awarded to an author on the basis of their body of work, rather than to, or for, a particular work itself. Other literary prizes for which all nationalities are eligible include, the Neustadt International Prize for Literature, the Man Booker International Prize and the Franz Kafka Prize.
Essays.
An essay consists of a discussion of a topic from an author's personal point of view, exemplified by works by Michel de Montaigne or by Charles Lamb. Genres related to the essay may include the memoir and the epistle.
Other prose literature.
Philosophical, historical, journalistic, and scientific writings are traditionally ranked as literature. They offer some of the oldest prose writings in existence. Novels and prose stories earned the names fiction to distinguish them from factual writing or non-fiction, which writers historically have crafted in prose.
Natural science.
As advances and specialization have made new scientific research inaccessible to most audiences, the literary nature of science writing has become less pronounced over the last 2 centuries. Now, science appears mostly in journals. Scientific works of Aristotle, Copernicus, and Newton still exhibit great value, but since the science in them has largely become outdated, they no longer serve for scientific instruction. Yet, they remain too technical to sit well in most programs of literary study. Outside of history of science programs, students rarely read such works.
Philosophy.
Philosophy has become an increasingly academic discipline. More of its practitioners lament this situation than occurs with the sciences. Nonetheless, most new philosophical work appears in academic journals. Major philosophers through history, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Augustine, Descartes, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, have become as canonical as any writers. Some recent philosophy works are argued to merit the title literature, such as some of the works by Simon Blackburn. But much of it does not, and some areas, such as logic, have become extremely technical to a degree similar to that of mathematics.
History.
A significant portion of historical writing ranks as literature, particularly the genre known as creative non-fiction. So can a great deal of journalism, such as literary journalism. However, these areas have become extremely large, and often have a primarily utilitarian purpose, to record data or convey immediate information. As a result, the writing in these fields often lacks a literary quality, although it often and in its better moments has that quality. Major literary historians including Herodotus, Thucydides and Procopius, all of whom count as canonical literary figures.
Law.
Law offers more ambiguity. Some writings of Plato and Aristotle, the law tables of Hammurabi of Babylon, or even the early parts of the Bible could be seen as legal literature. Roman civil law as codified in the Corpus Juris Civilis during the reign of Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire has a reputation as significant literature. The founding documents of many countries, including constitutions and law codes, can count as literature. However, most legal writings rarely exhibit much literary merit, as they tend to be rather garrulous.
Drama.
A play or drama is another classical literary form that has continued to evolve over the years. It generally comprises chiefly dialogue between characters, and usually aims at dramatic/theatrical performance, see theatre, rather than at reading. During the 18th and 19th centuries, opera developed as a combination of poetry, drama, and music. Nearly all drama took verse form until comparatively recently. Shakespeare could be considered drama. Romeo and Juliet, for example, is a classic romantic drama generally accepted as literature. Greek drama exemplifies the earliest form of drama of which we have substantial knowledge. Tragedy, as a dramatic genre, developed as a performance associated with religious and civic festivals, typically enacting or developing upon well-known historical or mythological themes. Tragedies generally presented very serious themes. With the advent of newer technologies, scripts written for non-staged media have been added to this form. War of the Worlds, radio, in 1938 saw the advent of literature written for radio broadcast, and many works of drama have been adapted for film or television. Conversely, television, film, and radio literature have been adapted to printed or electronic media.
Other narrative forms.
Electronic literature is a literary genre consisting of works that originate in digital environments. Films, videos and broadcast soap operas have carved out a niche which often parallels the functionality of prose fiction. Graphic novels and comic books present stories told in a combination of sequential artwork, dialogue and text.
Genres of literature.
Literary genre is a mode of categorizing literature. The term originates from French, designating a proposed type or class. However, such classes are subject to change, and have been used in different ways in different periods and traditions.
Literary techniques.
A literary technique or literary device can be used by authors in order to enhance the written framework of a piece of literature, and produce specific effects. Literary techniques encompass a wide range of approaches to crafting a work, whether a work is narrated in first person or from another perspective, whether to use a traditional linear narrative or a non-linear narrative, or the choice of literary genre, are all examples of literary technique. They may indicate to a reader that there is a familiar structure and presentation to a work, such as a conventional murder mystery novel. Or, the author may choose to experiment with their technique to surprise the reader. In this way, use of a technique can lead to the development of a new genre, as was the case with one of the first modern novels, Pamela by Samuel Richardson. Pamela is written as a collection of letter-writing correspondence, called epistolary technique. By using this technique, Pamela strengthened the tradition of the epistolary novel, a genre which had been practiced for some time already but without the same acclaim. Literary technique is distinguished from literary device, as military strategy is distinguished from military tactics. Devices are specific constructions within the narrative that make it effective. Examples include metaphor, simile, ellipsis, narrative motifs, and allegory. Even simple wordplay functions as a literary device. The narrative mode may be considered a literary device, such as the use of stream of consciousness narrative. Literary criticism implies a critique and evaluation of a piece of literature and, in some cases, it is used to improve a work in progress or a classical piece, as with an ongoing theatre production. Literary editors can serve a similar purpose for the authors with whom they work. There are many types of literary criticism and each can be used to critique a piece in a different way or critique a different aspect of a piece.
Legal status.
Literary works have been protected by copyright law from unauthorized reproduction since at least 1710. Literary works are defined by copyright law to mean any work, other than a dramatic or musical work, which is written, spoken or sung, and accordingly includes a table or compilation, other than a database, b. a computer program, c. preparatory design material for a computer program, and d. a database. It should be noted that literary works are not limited to works of literature, but include all works expressed in print or writing, other than dramatic or musical works.